This week on the show, we provide you with a big update, or a little bit less than that, to Spectre and Meltdown from various BSD projects, because this is going on and will continue to go on. A review of TrueOS from Linux, how to set up FreeBSD on a ThinkPad X240, and a whole bunch of beastie bits this week on this episode of BSD Now. BSD Now, episode 230, Your Questions, Part 3. Recorded for the 21st of January, 2018 we are in, and I'm still Benedict Oischling.
And I'm Alan Jude.
So, great week we have this week, a lot of show notes prepared for you, so you should get right into our headlines this week with KPTI patches landing in FreeBSD current.
Yes, so this is the mitigation for the Meltdown vulnerability. Or the first pass at it anyway. So after a heroic effort by Konstantin Belousov, or KIB, at FreeBSD.org, sponsored by the FreeBSD Foundation, the first patches for the Meltdown vulnerability have landed in FreeBSD head. So this creates separate page tables for both the kernel and userland, and switches between them as execution enters the kernel and returns to userland and so on, so that the memory that the kernel is using is not available during userland, so that the Meltdown vulnerability can't lead to it being stolen. Currently, this code is off by default, but we encourage people to test with it, so that we'll be able to merge it back to the release branches and release the security advisory. So to enable it, set vm.pmap.pti equals 1 in your loader.conf, reboot, and you'll be using it. Sadly, the existing implementation of PCID, or Process Context Identifiers, is not compatible with the new PTI code, and so will be disabled when you enable PTI, and that will decrease performance. A future patch will update our PCID code to be compatible with the way we're doing PTI, and that will bring most of the performance back on those processors that have that feature, which is pretty much everything since Intel added the, E number dash in front of the model number. So everything from Sandy Bridge up, basically. Some of the slightly older stuff, but anyway. So my understanding of what PCID is, it's just not perfect, but basically it allows the OS to tell the hardware, this chunk of memory is for this process, and that chunk of memory is for that process, and so on. And that provides two features. One is it makes sure that one program can't read the memory from the other program, or theoretically anyway. And it also means that when they need to flush those mappings, because something changes and going across CPU and so on, you can avoid flushing all of it and just say only the stuff for this process, or only the stuff that's not this process, and so on. But once the developers are relatively confident in the correctness of the code that's in head now, it will be ported back to FreeBSD 10 and 11 and be released as security fixes. Apparently porting it back to FreeBSD 11 will have some merge conflicts, but it looks like it should be relatively straightforward, whereas FreeBSD 10 is probably going to be a bit more work, just because, the kernel memory subsystem has changed a lot in the last 10 years since the FreeBSD 10 branch was started.
Yeah, there's a lot more work to be done to integrate that or port that back to those branches.
Yeah. There's quite a bit of detail in the commit message. If you have specific questions about what memory is getting mapped and unmapped and so on, and what stuff stays when you switch in userland, like the per CPU stuff and the IST stacks and the non-maskable interrupts and the fault handlers and all that kind of stuff. It's all there in the commit message. And it's expected to head back to the stable branches in about 2 weeks. And people are working on benchmarks already to see what the difference is with and without this feature enabled and so on. At the same time, Dag Erling, one of the former FreeBSD security officers, has created a Meltdown testing tool. It's up on his GitHub. It includes a couple of different bits. One of them is MD check, which does a meltdown check to tell you if your system is vulnerable. And then there's a meltdown attack tool where you can actually give it a specific virtual address and it will attempt to read it for you.
So you can see whether your system is affected or vulnerable.
And you can also check that, once you enable PTI, that it's actually working and so on. Apparently it doesn't work with all hardware yet. Some of the very newest CPUs seem to not quite work right. But it's something you can try, and even just reporting your results might be helpful to the development of this tool. There's also been a patch for Beehive. As you saw, most of the hypervisors have problems with some of the Spectre vulnerabilities. In particular, this first commit to Beehive provides some mitigation against one of the CVEs, the 5715, which is Spectre variant 2. And it clears a bunch of the registers upon returning from the guest, which aren't immediately collared by the host. This eradicates any remaining guest contents, limiting their usefulness in an exploit gadget.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes it harder for an attacker in the VM to affect the host system.
Okay. So we...
That fix applies to both VMX, which is the Intel stuff, and SVM, which is the AMD stuff.
Is that...
Go ahead.
I just want to know whether that's not the final iteration, that there might be some... it's because the message says that it's currently disabled, so people have to actually enable it because of the decreasing performance impacts.
Right. Yes, it's just commit it ahead, let people try it, and once it seems like it's not blowing up people's computers, PTI will be enabled by default in head, and then once that's good, we'll start merging it back to the stable branches.
Okay.
Being that we're recording this episode a week ahead of time, probably more stuff will change by the time you see this. So we recommend the FreeBSD wiki has a speculative execution vulnerabilities page, which shows each of the different architectures you might have, AMD, Intel, i386, various ARM64, ARMv7, Spark, etc., etc. And if you check out that page, you can find out the latest stuff. There's also annotations pointing to specific patches and revisions. You can see that the page table isolation patch, the review, and it's been committed. The ARM64 Spectre variant 2 fix has a review and has been committed. The Beehive partial Spectre variant 2 patch is committed. There's a ARMv7, so that's your 32-bit ARM devices. That one has a patch, but it's not been committed yet. But if you want to test, it's there. And then there's a pending patch for enabling the PCID stuff with the PTI patch on AMD 64, and that we hope to see maybe in time for when you're watching this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we want to thank people who are working on this, especially Konstantin, who has... I know that he's busy working on other stuff for the foundation, but now he got dragged off of this to fix those, and also Dag Erling for providing the checker tool, and all the other people who are working with security to make sure that those patches are tested and actually be created in the first place.
Yes, and it's mostly thanks to donations to the FreeBSD Foundation that it was possible to have Konstantin drop everything and spend 2 weeks working on this fix and getting it ready as quickly as possible. And so the best way to make sure that we can continue to do that going forward is to make a donation to the FreeBSD Foundation.
Right. So it's not just security issues that pop out of the clouds suddenly. Mm-hmm. It's also other stuff that's been done. I mean, Konstantin has work done in the kernel that's very, very deep in the innards that is not very visible sometimes, but it's still necessary to do. And there's also stuff he's doing in 2018 that is a little bit more visible for the end user.
Cool.
So yeah, once that's fixed, then we'll see other stuff, or he can return to his other programming jobs.
Yep. And thankfully, we also have this blog post here by Colin Percival actually explaining the Spectre Meltdown vulnerabilities in terms that we might be able to understand.
Yeah, because Colin has a way of describing it in layman's terms while still being technical enough to not make it too trivial. So this is quite a lot that he written up, but we pretty much boiled it down.
It's over 4,000 words, so it's longer than like a magazine article that I would write for the FreeBSD journal. But we'll excerpt a couple of bits here to help it make sense to you. So he says, by now I imagine that all of the regular readers of his blog and a large portion of the rest of the world have heard of the security issues dubbed Spectre and Meltdown. While there's some excellent technical explanations of the issues, in particular the Project Zero blog post is very good. Colin hasn't seen anyone make a serious attempt at explaining this at a level suited to a wider audience. While I have not been involved with the handling of this issue directly, I think it's time for me to step up and provide both a wider context and a more broadly understandable explanation. But first, we should establish Colin's bona fides in this particular area. So the story goes back to late 2004. So what's that, like 14 years ago now? Colin had just submitted his doctoral thesis and had a few months before he had to fly back to Oxford in the UK to defend his thesis. So he turned to some light reading, Intel's latest optimization manual, full of tips on how to write faster code. And, that's always been one of Colin's interests.
It's not exactly light reading, but
yes.
To each his own.
He found an interesting piece of advice on Intel CPU with hyperthreading. A common design choice, which is to align the top of the thread stack to the page boundary, should be avoided because it would result in some resources being overused and others being underused, with a resulting drop in performance. This started Colin thinking, if two programs can hurt each other's performance by accident, someone should be able to measure whether its performance is being hurt by the other. And if it can measure whether its performance is being hurt by people who are not following Intel's optimization guidelines, it should be able to measure whether its performance is being hurt by other patterns of resource usage. And if it can measure that, it should be able to make deductions about what the other program is actually doing. Mm-hmm. And so it begins. So Colin says, it took him a few days to convince himself that information could be stolen in this manner, but within a few weeks, he had been able to steal an RSA private key from OpenSSL from a different process. Then started the lengthy process of quietly notifying Intel and all the major operating system vendors. And on Friday, the 13th of May, 2005, he presented his paper on the new attack at BSDCan 2005. The first attack of this type exploiting how a running program causes changes in the microarchitectural state of CPU. And 3 months later, the team of Osvik, Shamar, and Tromer published their work where they were actually able to steal an AES key using the same method. Mm-hmm. And going on. We'll come back to how that comes into play a little bit later, other than the fact that Colin's been looking at this type of thing since the beginning. So then he wants to explain what is this side channel that we keep talking about. So these attacks exploit what's called the side channel. And what is it? It's when information is revealed in an inadvertent side effect of what you're doing. And he has some movie references and so on. But he has a great example here. So he has a little hypothetical example. Colin wants to know when his girlfriend's passport expires, but she won't tell him or won't show him her passport because she complains that it has a really horrible photo and refuses to tell Colin the expiry date. So Colin tells her that I'm going to take her to Europe on vacation in August, and then he watches what happens. If she runs out and renews her passport, he knows that the expiration date must have been before August or before they were going to return from the trip. If she doesn't, then the passport is valid at least through that date, and there's nothing else to do. Colin then knows that it will remain valid. So her desire to ensure that her passport would be valid, it inadvertently revealed to Colin some information, specifically what is the expiry date. So that's the side channel. She never showed Colin the expiry date, but by doing something else, Colin could deduce things about the expiry date.
It's a clever way of figuring it out. Yeah. And that's pretty much the same.
Yeah. So looking at Spectre variant 1 with the speculative execution, right, where this is where the processor guesses what you might be doing in order to get the right answer. So analogy for Spectre variant 1. I tell my girlfriend that I'm going to take her on vacation in June, but I don't tell her where. However, she knows that it'll either be somewhere in Canada, in which case she doesn't need a passport because they live in Vancouver, or it'll be somewhere in Europe, in which case she does need the passport. She knows that it takes some time to get a passport renewed, so she checks her passport, and if it's about to expire, she gets it renewed just in case that Colin will later reveal that they're going to Europe. Right, so speculatively going to renew the passport just in case. If it turns out they're going to Europe, that works. If they're staying in Canada, it didn't cost anything really. If I later tell her that we're only going to Ottawa, well, she didn't need to renew her passport after all, but in the meantime, her behavior has already revealed to me whether her passport is about to expire or not. So that's what Google refers to as variant 1 of the Spectre vulnerability. Even though she didn't need her passport, she made sure it was still valid just in case, and that way the observer could find out about that. For Spectre variant 2, it's a bit different. In this case, the processor doesn't know which branch you're going to take, but it looks at what you've done in the past and guesses based on that. So in this case, the analogy is, I spend a week talking about how Oxford is a wonderful place to visit, and I really enjoyed the years that I spent there, and then I tell her that I'm taking her on vacation. She very reasonably assumes that, since I've been talking about Oxford so much, I must be planning on taking her to England, and runs off to check her passport and potentially renew it. But in fact, I tricked her, and I'm only planning on taking her to Ottawa. That seems like a little bit of a letdown for his girlfriend.
It's a bad deal in this case.
Well, not that there's anything wrong with Ottawa, but
no, but it's still, yeah, it's the same like Berlin for me and going to Ottawa.
Yeah. And so that leads us with Meltdown. This one gets a little tortured, but it's okay. So Colin tells his girlfriend that he's going to take her to the Korean Peninsula for vacation. She knows that her passport is valid for long enough, but she immediately runs off to check that her North Korean visa hasn't expired. Why does she have a North Korean visa, you ask? Good question. Turns out she doesn't. But she runs off to check its expiry date anyway. Because she doesn't have a North Korean visa, she somehow checks the expiration date on someone else's North Korean visa. And then, if it's about to expire, runs out to renew it. And so by telling her that I was taking her to Korea for a vacation, I find out something she couldn't have told me if she wanted to. Because she doesn't have a North Korean visa, but somehow, because of some violation of the laws of physics in the processor, in this case, she was able to check the expiry date and possibly renew someone else's visa.
Yeah, which is bad.
This is how a program can leak memory out of the kernel that it shouldn't have had access to in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then there's a section about how users can protect themselves, pretty much instructing.
Install the updates when they're available. Turns out for the microcode updates, maybe don't be too eager, because twice now Intel's released it and then a day or two later said, actually, that turns out to cause more problems than it solves.
Yeah, and also don't click on anything in emails that says click here to update your vulnerable system, because that might be malware. But other than that, if it's an official channel where you get updates from the vendor, then by all means install those.
Yeah, but there's a whole section there on that, and you can read that if you're interested. But I like Colin's thoughts on disclosure and how that worked in this particular case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, remember, folks, this was disclosed prematurely, so there was still an embargo until January 9th, and it got out before that, so his thoughts about...
They kind of retroactively changed the embargo to like the 4th and when Google published their stuff, but yeah. Anyway, So Colin's final thoughts on vulnerability disclosure. The way these issues were handled was a mess, frankly. I expected better of Google, I expected better of Intel, and I expected better of the Linux community. When I found that hyperthreading was easily exploitable, I spent 5 months notifying the security community and preparing everyone for my announcement of the vulnerability. But when the embargo ended at midnight UTC and FreeBSD published its advisory a few minutes later, the broader world was taken entirely by surprise. Nobody knew that this was coming, aside from people who needed to know, and the people who needed to know had months of warning. Contrast is what happened this time around. Google discovered the problem and reported it to Intel, AMD, and ARM on June 1st. Did they go around contacting all the operating systems which would need to work on these fixes? Not even close. FreeBSD wasn't notified until a few days before Christmas, over 6 months after the vulnerability had been discovered. Now, FreeBSD can occasionally respond very quickly to security vulnerabilities, even when they arise at inconvenient times. For example, Colin has one example where in 2009, vulnerability was reported on November 30th at 22:12, and Colin had it patched on December 1st at 01:20, which is only about 3 hours later. But, that was an extremely simple fix, which needed only a few lines of code, whereas Spectre Meltdown issues are rather a bit larger.
Yeah.
But to make things worse, the Linux community was notified and couldn't keep their mouth shut. Standard practice for multi-vendor advisories like this is that the embargo date is set and nobody does anything public prior to that date. People don't publish advisories, they don't commit patches into their public source code repos, and they definitely don't engage in arguments on public mailing lists about whether the patch is needed for different CPUs. As a result, despite an embargo date being set on January 9th, by January 4th, everyone who cared knew about the issue and there was code being passed around on Twitter for exploiting it. This is not the first time I've seen people get sloppy with embargoes recently, but it's by far the worst case. As an industry, we pride ourselves on the concept of responsible disclosure, ensuring that people are notified in time to prepare fixes before an issue is disclosed publicly. But in this case, there's far too much disclosure and nowhere near enough responsibility. We can do better, and I surely hope that next time we do.
Yep.
But yes, there's
It's quite a good
great
write-up.
sections in the middle of this about what you should do and also what to expect from the next wave of vulnerabilities that are going to come at this, including attacks against HTTPS and P-code interpreters and JIT and all the various things that are going to happen.
Yeah, so this is quite a good summary thus far, and I guess we'll see. Maybe Colin is giving a talk about this in the future. We'll see.
No, I think his HBSDCon talk is about making your computer boot faster.
Oh yeah, that's what I want to see. This is something positive to look forward to.
Yes.
But yeah, if you have more details, I think Colin has provided some contact information there, and also, send us questions. There's always room for discussions.
Yep. This week's episode of BSD Now is brought to you by IX Systems. Head over to ixsystems.com/BSD Now and check it out.
Yeah, whether it's a big server or a small backup systems under your desk, IX Systems can build those systems for you, or you look at one of those that they have pre-prepared, like the FreeNAS Mini or the FreeNAS Mini XL. So those are entry-level backup devices for your storage capacity needs. And if you want to have a little bit bigger server need, because you're building a new open source stack for, a website, or you want to have a little more cloud integration, or building some high-tech CPU monster that has a lot of processes in them, then you can ask IX Systems what kind of systems they would buy, or not buy, build for you, because they're building those systems to customers' needs, and will provide you with the exact components that you need. And some components will work better than others, so they will recommend those, of course. And that's what they will provide for you. So they won't just give you a system off the rack. They will just ask what the purpose of that system is, of that server or that that rack that you're building maybe, and then they will tell you, oh, you should avoid buying these components, or you should try combining this component with the other one, and that will provide you with that minimum amount of performance or storage capacity, whatever your needs are.
Yeah, basically every system is custom tailored to fit like a glove for your specific workload. But for me, like my most recent order, which I ordered, I guess, late last week and it arrived Monday, was more hard drives for the shelves I bought in like November or December there. And it turns out I even just buy a box of hard drives from IX now, because they test the drives first and eliminate the ones that might die right away. They put them in the sleds for me, so I don't have to sit there and put in the screws. It means that when the box shows up, you carry it over to the server, start popping the drives in, expand my pool, and within 20 minutes of the FedEx driver knocking at the door saying, "Here's your box of hard drives," my pool was 65 terabytes bigger. Mm-hmm. Just like that. All done.
Yeah, and that's simple.
And the best part was the price I paid for the drives was less than I could get those same drives on Amazon or Newegg or something. And they included the sled. I'm like, how do they do that? Magic.
I want to have that.
Yes. And they come with a more hassle-free warranty and service than if I just bought the hard drive somewhere else. So, IX provides the whole solution for the whole lifetime of the server. And that's really makes a big difference for us, especially since we have machines that I've never seen in places I've never been to. And if they have a problem, I need a solution that's going to work that way and not involve me having to go there or something. And IX has made that work, and it's really worth it. So you should get in touch with them. Tell them we sent you. They will be extra nice.
Mm-hmm. All right. Our next story is CPU microcode update code for AMD 64. This is over at the OpenBSD journal, undeadly.org. And it's a small piece, but still valuable in ways to read, because it's the OpenBSD's reaction to the recent Intel vulnerabilities. So Patrick Wild, I guess, Patrick at openbsd.org, recently committed some code that will update the Intel microcode on many Intel CPUs, a diff initially written by Stefan Fritsch, SF at OpenBSD. And the microcode of your CPU is basically the firmware that runs on your Intel processor or whatever processor you might have, depending on the vendor, defining its instruction set in terms of so-called micro instructions. So in there's a little code execution engine, very, very basic, that makes the CPU behave in certain ways. The new code depends, of course, on the corresponding firmware package that's ported by Patrick, which can be installed using a recent FW_update utility. And that way you can apply these updates to your CPU. Of course, this all plays into the recently revealed problems with Intel and other CPUs like Meltdown and Spectre. We covered this. And Theo de Rat has also explained the workings. We covered it on the last week's episode. On OpenBSD Tech, there is a big discussion, of course. They detailed some of the challenges in updating the microcode on CPUs where your operating system is already starting to run.
Yeah, so there's a post here by Theo. It says that Patrick and others committed AMD 64 Intel CPU microcode update code over the last few days. The approach isn't perfect, but it's good enough for a start. I want to explain the situation. When you run the FW update tool, you'll get the new firmware files. Upon a reboot, it will attempt to update the microcode on your running CPUs. Maybe there isn't new microcode. Maybe your BIOS has a copy of the microcode and installs it before you boot OpenBSD. But this firmware installation is done a little late currently. Doing it better will require some work on the boot blocks to find the firmware files, but time is a bit short to do that right now. The branch target cache flushing feature added in this new microcode isn't actually being used by OpenBSD yet. There's more code that has to be written, but again, other work is happening first. Also, Intel is saying that their new microcode sucks and people should wait a little bit. So if you remember last week, we talked about Intel had released some new microcode and then called it back because it could cause the CPUs to randomly reboot. Well, they've since released new microcode and then called that back because it was causing unexpected page faults. And they've asked Lenovo to stop distributing the newer firmware for the ThinkPads that included it. So yeah, eventually there will be microcode that you'll actually want to install. We'll have to see when that is. There's possibly not that much of a hurry to install it until your OS can actually take use of the features, and hopefully by that time they'll have a stable version of the microcode out. And Theo has a nice little quip at the end of his email here. Hi, my name is Intel, and I'm a cheating speculator.
Yeah, well, there's some truth to that. Yeah, so that's this story. It also kind of connects to the next story, which has Intel as a BSD user. I am FS checking pissed because we're not that kind of show. We're using different words as much as we try at least. So this one is over at malcunt.net, and this is pretty much a blog post about the whole, Meltdown Inspector. Yet another viewpoint, and it goes off perspective, and it goes off pretty strongly. It starts with, I wasn't going to write anything on the recently found x86 architecture related bugs. I'm not a kernel developer nor even a programmer, and I can't say that I have a solid understanding of what Meltdown and Spectre attacks are. Also, there already is a ton of articles and posts written by people who have no grasp of the subject. I am, however, a malcontent, hence the website's name, and I find this a good way to express my feelings. So again, we're just reading the news here. This is not our views Intel, he writes, as a BSD user, I am FS checking pissed. Meltdown, Spectre, and BSD, the pissed part. Part of his work is Unix-like systems administration, including BSDs and Linuxes. As much as he's happy with Linux challenges already made, I am beyond pissed about how the BSDs were handled by Intel, because they were not. FreeBSD security team received some heads up just before Christmas, while OpenBSD, NetBSD, and Dragonfly BSD teams received no prior warnings. Meltdown and Spectre attacks are hard to perform. It is a hard work to mitigate them in the software, as the bugs lay in the CPUs and not fixable by microcode updates. Developers are trying to mitigate these bugs in a way that will deliver smallest performance losses. A lot of time-consuming work is needed to fix CPU vendors' mistakes. Linux developers had this time. BSD developers did not. So that's already starting quite heavily, but it continues. With BSD user base too small? BSD user base is small in comparison to Linux. Seems that it's too small for Intel. PlayStation 4 consoles are FreeBSD based, as we covered in the show, of course, and use AMD CPUs, but I think it's safe to say that gaming devices are not the most important systems to be fixed. Netflix serves the contents of FreeBSD, but the bugs are not remotely exploitable. Possibly not including JavaScript, but it's running someone's code locally. So there's probably not much harm to be done here either. However, gamers and Netflix aren't the only ones who use BSD systems. I'd say that there is more than a few FreeBSD, NetBSD, OpenBSD, and Dragonfly BSD servers on the internet. So in March 2017, Intel promised more timely support to FreeBSD. They knew about flaws in their CPUs in June and decided that timely manner is the end of December, short before the embargo was to be lifted. Yeah, if you see it from this...
And that was only really after being pressured by other people.
Yeah. So I guess Intel didn't harmly exclude the BSDs, but still the communication could have been
there's
better.
Different parts of Intel. The Intel group that was pledging more timely support was the Intel software arm, which is different than the people that make the CPUs and different from the security team and so on. But
it's a big company. It's definitely a lot of people communicating in different ways.
And if Intel was doing the embargo right, the Intel people that know about FreeBSD wouldn't have known about this vulnerability. but still.
Okay, the last bits of the blog post that we have here is Intel and Google, probably Intel more. It was your job to pick the correct people to whom the bugs can be disclosed. In his humble opinion, you chose poorly by disclosing these issues with only Apple, Microsoft, and Linux Foundation of OS vendors. You did much harm to the BSD community. And Intel, it's your bugs. And you offered more support to the FreeBSD Foundation less than 3 months prior to being informed. They actually did support us in different ways, but it's not been that visible yet. But that's a different issue. So less than 3 months prior to being informed and on the flaws in your products. I don't want to write more here as the wording would be too strong. Oh, wow. Okay. It stopped at the right. So definitely Intel did some good work with the collaboration, and the collaboration is still going on. I mean, it's not that any one side cut any ties here. So we're still in the early phase. We did some good code exchanges and also access to developer documentation, but this bug or this vulnerability pretty much hit everyone by surprise. And even though Intel knew about it for months, it's still their thing to disclose, even though people don't like that. And I'm not defending Intel here. It's just, it's easy to place blame and not seeing the other side. But sure, it's a mess, and they will have to deal with the cleanup for months and sometimes even years, because pretty much every CPU is affected, as you know. And the good part that could come out of this is pretty much that they learn from this miscommunication and include the BSDs in the future. So that's the hope I have from that. So, and ultimately we have to see from each new vulnerability or from each new thing that comes to the light, we'll have to see how people manage that. And I mean, security vulnerability disclosure is a difficult topic because some people don't want to.
This one was just on a different scale than what we're used to. It's not something that was relatively easy to fix, and it was something that affected every operating system. That's not the normal case. We have relatively well set up procedures for dealing with OS level bugs or application level bugs, but processor level bugs are relatively infrequent and usually don't reach back 10 plus years of hardware either.
And I mean, I can understand that there are people enraged or don't like how the situation was handled. But I think currently the BSDs are in the loop. They get the updates, they get the information, and even though we couldn't have had much time to prepare for this as other vendors who were informed, there's still some healthy back and forth. And of course, we're also using other channels to complain. So in the future,
for both AMD and Intel, they had lots of warning, and they don't have working firmware revisions out yet. For a while, AMD was claiming they weren't vulnerable to some of the parts of Spectre, and it turns out that they are, and they're going to have to do some work on that. So they maybe wasted a bunch of their lead time thinking that they didn't have to worry about it. Intel seems like they couldn't properly test their various ages of hardware with their new microcode. It's like, I know it's complicated, but you had 6 months warning and you don't have a working solution yet.
Yeah. What people could do is decide, well, if I'm buying a new computer, I may be looking at other alternatives or at other CPU vendors.
I don't know that there's much that's available that's current that's not vulnerable.
Right, but if you're a home user,
CERT had to go and change their advisory, which was buy a new CPU, because there's no new CPU you can buy that doesn't have this problem.
Right, but in the future, I mean, like 2-3 years when you typically replace your computer, and if you still remember that this thing happened, because there might be something coming out tomorrow and that lets you forget. Who's still thinking about? I was having there was a vulnerability that no one is talking about anymore, and everyone was like total outcrying it. Can't remember the name. We have so many code names now for these vulnerabilities. So I know it's hard, and we need to fix this, of course. And yeah, as long as we're on the problems and have people who can fix that on the processor side as well as on the operating system side, and I think that's the best way to make the best out of this mess. So, time for our interview section this week. We have a viewer interviews question still left from last year. Remember, you can send us questions for Alan and me, or both, or even our show producer, JT. If you're interested in anything.
Yeah, like we normally do the questions that we answer in the feedback section, but these are more interview questions. So the viewers of the show interviewing the hosts instead of, how we normally interview people.
We flip things around sometimes.
Yeah.
And this is part 3, so we already did 2. If you haven't seen those, you can find them in the show notes archive on bsdnow.tv. But this one is a question or questions for Alan. So I'm going to be the interviewer. I read the questions and Alan will answer them.
And then I think we'll do Benedict next week.
Yeah, so we have Alan and me, and as long as there are questions, we'll be happy to answer them. Okay, it starts off with, these days, do you consider yourself more of a programmer or a sysadmin? Which one do you enjoy more?
That's a complicated question. Probably more of a sysadmin. My day job is mostly sysadmin, but I'm enjoying the programming. I'm still, for C and so on, and actually like doing operating system level development, I'm still pretty new, but I'm enjoying it and learning it. So I'd say I enjoy the programming more, but that might have to do with I mostly do the sysadmin thing as my day job, and the programming thing is my hobby now.
Mm-hmm. Is there? Do you think there's more programming in sysadmin, or is there less sysadmining in programming? Because there's a little bit of both.
Yeah. So like, I'm definitely become a better sysadmin by increasing my programming ability. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I sometimes think I'm in an interesting position as a programmer in understanding the sysadmin side of it better and making tools that make sense from the sysadmin side, who generally is ultimately going to be the user of the tool. Many developers build tools that make sense the way they're going to use them, which is fine. But if it's a tool specifically for sysadmins, the interface needs to be what they want it to be.
Mm. And I think you're also in a unique position in that you don't have to go to a different department to do the operating system part, because you're pretty much the same person doing both ops and programming. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a valued question. So the next one is, does FreeBSD or the BSDs in general enable your business, or would another operating system suit your needs just as well?
I suppose it might be possible to do most of what we do with a Linux, but I wouldn't be able to do it. My Linux skills are not that good. We get a bunch of unique advantages out of FreeBSD, especially when we were first starting. ZFS was really not an option on Linux. Like the ZFS on Linux project was maybe just starting and people hadn't really heard of it yet. So for the storage that we do, very much needed to be BSD back in the time. I guess it could have been the Solaris somehow, but it's mostly been tainted by the fact that I've been a FreeBSD person for, 16 years now? And so that's what I was going to use pretty much no matter what. But, a lot of parts of our business have had advantage from that. The fact that we have this kind of inside track on what's happening in BSD, and we have the ability to very mildly maybe, but steering efforts to make sure they're going towards what's useful to us. And just the fact that, there's a bunch of other CDNs that use FreeBSD means that we can all work together on the bits that make sense. FreeBSD has advantages for us, although most of those come from the particular people that work for us having more experience in BSD and being able to leverage that better, if that makes sense. Because we have BSD people, we get more advantage from BSD because of our deeper knowledge of BSD.
And it's also quite difficult to find those people in the first place with the BSD background, or at least the knowledge that they've used it at least a little bit. Okay. The next question is also a little bit similar to this one. You've hinted that you use FreeBSD as part of your business. Can you elaborate on that and give some technical details on how it's used in that environment? As much as you
we
can.
have a couple of different bits. The biggest one that's my job is storage. So we store videos for video on demand. So people upload catalogs of video that they want to make available to their customers. But we also have a live stream recording system where we record what people live stream and archive it. This generates hundreds of terabytes of video files, and they have to be stored and managed and backed up. And we do that with ZFS and multiple IX system servers that do all the work. And so we leverage FreeBSD for that a lot. We also have some very heavyweight databases, and we use ZFS and FreeBSD with the compressed ARC feature for that, because it means we can fit that highly compressible database data in, or more of it in the same amount of RAM, or it in less RAM, depending on how you're doing it. But with a 3 to 5x compression ratio on the data you're storing in RAM, you get much better cache hit ratios. All of our edge servers that actually feed live streams of video to people or cache and display the on-demand content run FreeBSD. We use jails to separate different applications and so on. So on our main hosting servers, there will be 8 or 10 jails on any particular machine. A database here, another job over here. We also have specific jails where customers have access to it in order to manage their video content. So customers can actually SSH in and use rsync or whatever to copy videos back and forth. That all happens in a jail so that they can't touch anything that they're not supposed to. But it also means that when it's time for us to upgrade a storage server, if we're maybe replacing the hardware instead of just putting in bigger drives or something, that whole jail can just be picked up and moved. That containerization has made our life much easier and made hardware migrations take 3 minutes of downtime, where we've used ZFS incremental replication to keep the new location caught up with what data is available. Then we shut down the jail, sync the last couple of minutes of differences, bring up the jail on the other machine, and the job's moved, and the user doesn't feel any long-term downtime. They had like 3 minutes of time for everything to sync over, and then they're out. We use Carp for the web servers, so we'll have a pool of web servers serving traffic, and they use Carp to automatically fail over if one falls over, if we need to take it down. Nice thing with Carp is there's a sysctl, we set the demotion level, and the server just gracefully hands overload to the other server, and then we can take it down and do the maintenance. Actually, tomorrow we'll be doing one of those where we'll be taking down one of the web servers and replacing some old 2 terabyte drives with a smaller number of drives. So it'll be a new pool, so the old data will go away. And then the other half of the chassis will be filled with SSDs instead of hard drives. And so we can do all that without actually impacting the customer. And as I said, the edge servers, we keep... one jail has the HTTP caching stuff, so Varnish and all that running. And then another jail runs the video stuff. Some of that involves some Java, and so we were very happy to keep that in a jail, but also so that we don't have problems with package conflicts, or when we want to do package upgrades, we can upgrade one service to get, say, the newest version of Varnish without having to update the other service at the same time. So we can have different release schedules for updating the versions of packages and so on in different applications for us. One of the other advantages of FreeBSD is with ports and Poudriere, and the fact that we can build our own packages means we can add our own packages that aren't in FreeBSD. We can pin versions. We can sync things, and we can just generally have much more control over what packages are available for which jobs, and make sure that, when a new version of Varnish comes out because they found a vulnerability or a bug or something, we can have that deployed in a couple of minutes. We don't have to even wait for upstream if it gets to that point. But usually upstream's just as quick as we are, and we can roll that out. But it also means we can make sure that we only roll out the bits of it we want. And it's just being able to custom compile Nginx the way we want. Like, we don't use the dynamically loadable modules. We still use the static ones even on the newer version. So the fact that we can just take a couple of options in the port, custom compile it the way we want, and get the best performance, that's a big deal to us.
Mm-hmm. That's certainly an interesting scenario. It's storage and
use
networking.
FreeBSD as routers, so we're happy with that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I said, it's an interesting business. It's not just storage or networking; it's the combination of both.
Yep.
And yeah, so certainly, and it's also, I mean, it started as a startup, and you're still doing it mostly with a small group.
It was never a startup, but yes, we started it.
Yeah, not the typical startup like. Yeah, it's certainly an interesting business.
Yep.
Okay. Next one is the ZFS ferry comes along, and if you are allowed 3 wishes for anything at all to be implemented or changed in ZFS, what would that be and why?
Yes. So my personal needs and desires are probably a little bit different than everybody else's. I know lots of people would like block pointer rewrite or something, although I'm not going to. I'm actually going to say everything I'm wishing for here I think is actually possible, and we might actually get in the next maybe 10 years for some of this stuff, but versus some things people wish for are probably just never going to happen. I kept mine to things that are actually possible even. So the first one for me is per dataset throughput and IOPT limits. So in FreeBSD, you can do like per jail limiting of datasets and IOPTs and stuff, and that can apply to ZFS in addition to other file systems and so on. But at the ZFS level, if you could control, this one data set can't use all the available capacity of my pool. And, if I give each customer a different data set and say each one can only have 25% of the available capacity, even if there's 100 of them, it means no one customer can chew up all the available power. That would be very useful. This other one's kind of 2 or 3 related features, but the one is per file cloning. Currently, you can clone a whole data set, and that makes sense. If you're going to do a bunch of VMs, even if they're file-based instead of VDEV-based or ZVol-based, you end up with 1 file per data set in order to be able to clone them and snapshot them nicely. But if you could clone just 1 file out of a data set, that would be pretty interesting. And that leads to like a special version of CP or a ZFS CP command to actually copy a file, which is basically cloning it and so on. And other interesting one is ZFS move command. I want to move a file from this data set to that data set, but without copying it and rewriting it, basically just re-owning it. That might be harder. In particular, I don't know how the old snapshots would be able to keep track of it. And that gets more complicated. Although I'd be able to live with a version of that required you didn't have snapshots on that data set. Sometimes I just have a big data set and I'd like to break it up into 3 smaller ones, and I would like to not have to rewrite all the data. So
have you recommended it to the ZFS folks? Any of that?
Well, everybody there is pretty busy.
Somebody
would have to. Someday, hopefully, I will have a deep enough understanding to see what that would actually look like at the ZFS level and be able to propose something more concrete than I have this random idea. And then the big feature would be some kind of cluster support so that you could have multiple ZFSs all working together. There's a bunch of work going on with things like Ceph where you could do it on top of ZFS, and that probably is the easiest way forward for now. But, I know Matt Aarons has sketched out napkin drawings of what a clustered ZFS might look like, and maybe someday.
Makes it interesting to see what's happening. Okay, good choices. Certainly something that should be considered. Next question. Alan, you have previously mentioned that you have worked on FreeBSD on MIPS. What made you choose the Onion Omega over something like the Raspberry Pi?
So originally how this started was conversation on IRC, and there was talk about this specific TP-Link router, the like WDR 3600, that ran an Atheros CPU and so on, that was MIPS, and that FreeBSD just worked on. And so I ended up buying like 20 of these and bringing them to the BSD can and soldering on the serial ports and playing with them. Sadly, mine is sitting ready to be played with in the living room without being played with for 2 and a bit years now. But the reason I chose the Onion Omega is it's the same chip as that device. And so I knew basically everything worked. It just needed some of the integration to be able to control the LEDs and stuff. And that it had working Wi-Fi. My particular use case for it was, and the expansion docks for it made it slightly more appealing. In particular, I wanted to build a couple of specific things, and just the way that the Onion Omega was laid out with a real Ethernet port rather than a USB-based one, having a relay system so you can actually use it to power things on and off, to switch power, instead of just GPIO, so like switching like 120 volt power, and a couple things like that. And the fact that I had already had experience with that particular CPU and making a version of FreeBSD that worked on it. I have a Raspberry Pi 2 and a Raspberry Pi 3. I admit I've never really done anything with them either. But that was just what I've been playing with at the time. I've dabbled kind of all over on FreeBSD. There's too many different things to do. I would have loved to, and now that the Onion Omega 2 works, and I have a couple of those, and I've never even powered one of them on before, I feel a bit bad, but at the same time, there's just too many things to do.
Well, who knows? Maybe in the future.
One of the other draws for the Onion Omega was they were talking about using, build your application in Python or Ruby or PHP or whatever, and it just works, and it was all on Linux. I'm like, well, you could probably do the same thing on FreeBSD, and I bet I could make that work, and I mostly did. I just never got around to finishing it.
Okay. Well, I mean, we have projects, and sometimes other things become more important or more interesting, but that doesn't mean that's no one else is interested in that, or there's no effort being done in this. I mean, for my case, I'm having my Raspberry Pi 3 running my monitoring system for 3 months now. It's quietly chugging along in the corner. No one notices it, and I'm pretty happy with it.
Yes. If I ever found a round to it under a couch cushion or something, I'd like to use one of my Omegas or the Omega 2 to build a temperature measuring thing to put in my server room. The air conditioner is at one side of the room, and it says what it thinks the temperature is, but I want to know what the temperature is at the back of the server rack, and graph how that changes. Currently, I see very interesting effects also between the temperature outside and the temperature inside. And when outside gets below freezing, suddenly the air conditioner doesn't have to work very hard to keep the room well below the rest of the temperature of the rest of the house. But there's this weird crossover point where as soon as the temperature outside gets above a certain level, the air conditioner has to actually work to keep the temperature in the server room under like 28 degrees Celsius, which is quite warm.
Yep. Okay, next question. What is BSD Now's association with Jupiter Broadcasting, and how did the relationship come to be? Jupiter seems to be associated with several Linux-themed podcasts, and I'm wondering, or the person who asked this, is wondering how and why BSD Now joined Jupiter. The two communities, Linuxes and BSDs, don't always seem to mix freely, or do they?
Yeah, so the history there goes back way before any of that. So I found out about Jupiter Broadcasting originally when they moved their IRC chat room to the network of IRC servers that I ran, which is now Geek Shed. And one day their IRC channel was much bigger than normal. And I was just checking up on them because it seemed like it was maybe bot attacks or spammers or something. But it wasn't. They were holding some kind of contest. I didn't realize it. And some person in the chat room had asked, what is the name of Captain Archer's dog? And I said,
Porthos. Oh, sorry.
And possibly because I was the IRC server administrator sitting on the hub, my answer showed up on their screen first. So that meant I won the contest and got a closed beta invite for the Star Trek Online MMO, which Jupiter Broadcasting had a podcast about. And that's how I first got involved with Jupiter Broadcasting, was that, and then eventually hosting the, at the time, TeamSpeak server that was used for the bunch of people that were playing the game, and building content for what was then the podcast about this MMO. And, over time, eventually, with the release of, I think, FreeBSD 9.0, I was interviewed on their... was it the Linux Action Show back, I don't know how many years ago that would have been, like 2010 or earlier, 2009 maybe, something like that.
People can look that up in the archive.
And talked a bit about FreeBSD on the Linux Show. And that went pretty well. And then a couple of weeks later, I had made 2 or 3 tutorial videos on getting started with FreeBSD and submitted them to the show, and they used them to stretch out an episode where somebody was missing or something. And then at one point, I ended up filling in for one of the hosts on the podcast for a week, and while they were away sick or something. And eventually, I actually went on to host the Linux Action Show for a while, but that was short-lived. Anyway, that led to... Chris from Jupiter Broadcasting and I starting a sysadmin podcast that was OS agnostic, and that was TechSnap. And I did that for 300 weeks, which was about 6 years almost. And I don't know, so that was also on Jupiter Broadcasting, and even though it wasn't Linux-based. And at some point of doing that, somebody in the chat room had said, well, we should have a podcast about BSD. And I was like, I don't know that there's enough news every week in BSD to do a podcast.
Remember, this is episode 230.
Yeah, and boy, was I wrong. But I said, okay, to prove it, why don't we write up the show notes for like the first 3 episodes? And if we can find enough stuff to do 3 episodes relatively quickly, maybe that means there's enough to do something every week. And there was. So then started the hunt to find a co-host. I asked many of the usual suspects, but Drew Levine recommended Chris Moore, and I thought, sure, although I would assume he's way too busy with, what was it, I think 4 kids at the time, and running the whole PCBSD, which is now TrueOS project. But no, he was available to do it. And then during the first episode, he popped out the latest of his kids. And so that actually meant the first episode was the interview was recorded on the original intended day, but the rest of the episode wasn't actually recorded until the next day, once Chris was back. Also, props for being back the next day. Good job.
Yeah.
And that's how BSD Now started. So BSD Now is on Jupiter Broadcasting because that was the only podcast network I knew, but it's where the network where I was already doing my first podcast. So doing a second one there made sense. Originally the only reason it had its own website separate from the Jupiter Broadcasting website was so that our producer could actually post show notes and write the tutorials and edit them. At that time, Jupiter Broadcasting didn't really have the concept of show producers like we have now, or researchers and so on. But anyway, that's why it's on Jupiter Broadcasting, is because they had an established audience, and because it was where I was already doing a sysadmin podcast, so it made sense to just add the BSD podcast to that. And mostly because they do all the hard work of making the podcast. Like Benedict and I show up here and talk into the camera.
The easy part.
Yeah. But it's Richard from Jupiter Broadcasting that actually edit this into something that you can actually watch and, manage it and get it posted to YouTube and the iTunes store and all the RSS feeds and all the stuff that you actually do to get the content. I just record 5 or 6 little files using the software here and drop them on an FTP server or on my NAS, and he comes and SFTPs in to get them. They do all the editing and managing all the other stuff. And BSD Now wouldn't exist if I had to do all that. That's why it's there, because they do all the work.
Yeah, the people behind the scenes who are not seen or sometimes don't get the credit they deserve, which, people just see an episode appearing every week, and it's everyone, this is working somehow. It's like a TV news. There's also a lot of people behind the scenes you never see. And that makes it successful because people do some of the work other people don't want to do. And it all comes together and makes this show possible. So thanks for those efforts and all the work they're doing every week. Okay, next question. What kind of keyboard is that? Have you ever tried an ErgoDox? The ErgoDox EZ is made by a Canadian, by the way.
Yeah, okay. So, which one? This one. Can't really see that very well. I have 2 keyboards, one on my lap right now, because this is my nice mechanical keyboard. This is a Cooler Master Keys Pro L or whatever. It's the large format one. It's Cherry MX Blue switches and makes all the noise. This is an old Microsoft keyboard that I use because it's quiet. So I use the quiet one during the show to avoid the clackety-clack noise that upsets people. Originally, possibly when they asked this question, I was still using a Razer Black Widow from 2010 maybe, or 2011. They've since changed the model of the keyboard to have plastic switches that they make instead of the Cherry MX switches. So I bought a different keyboard. But basically, Cherry MX Blues is what I've been using for quite a while. And this is just the newer keyboard. Much better keyboard. Very slim, so it doesn't have much bezel, which was an adjustment from the original keyboard. The Black Widow had a nice bezel on the front. So currently there's a gap between the wrist pad and the keyboard in order for the keys to be in the same place my fingers expect them to be. But it works, and I'm very happy with it. I've never heard of this ErgoDox. Might have to look at it, I guess.
Mm. Yeah, it's more ergonomically
I don't touch type. I just whack keys with 2 fingers from each hand, so I don't have problems with RSI.
Well, okay. All right. Our last question is, you mentioned when doing one of your talks on UCL for FreeBSD that you had only recently learned C. The question submitter asked, he's also aware that of your history of contributing to FreeBSD, the handbook, and the documentation in general. Given you started with C relatively recently, what made you want to learn it? How quickly did you pick it up? And is it your favorite language?
Yeah, so I still consider myself very new with C, although it's actually been a while now. But so, yes, I started with documentation and so on. What made me want to learn C was libucl. Very nice. I was doing some stuff with shell script, which I'd been learning better. Like, I'd played around with shell script for years, but I hadn't really learned the part that makes it like magical until I was working on the ZX for script and the BSD install stuff. So suddenly I wanted to use libucl in a shell script I was writing to manage Beehive. And obviously that doesn't work. So then I was like, well, what if I could write a very small C program that would let me use UCL from the command line, from a shell script. So some people might be familiar with, there's this program called JQ that's a JSON parser command line thing, and you can like write these complex select queries to extract a certain bit of information out of a JSON. I wanted to build something kind of like that, but for UCL, which happens to also do JSON. So I started writing UCL CMD, which was basically a very thin wrapper around the libraries so that you could use it from the command line. And this ended up me learning some C. How quickly did it pick up? Some bits took more than other bits. There are still bits I probably don't understand fully enough. The basic stuff, like for loops, while loops, ifs, and so on, I had kind of seen everywhere else. Between, playing with Perl and PHP and some Java and other programming languages, I was familiar with the concept and the layout of the basic structures of the control flow stuff. How functions look like in the prototypes, and doing if statements and for loops and while loops and so on. So that part was relatively straightforward. It was more figuring out the pointer bits that are usually hidden from you in a language like PHP, and the differences between passing a pointer and passing the value of a pointer and so on, and the layers of abstraction where you can pass a pointer to a pointer to a pointer, or passing the value of a pointer to a pointer. And so on.
And const pointers and things like that.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say it's my favorite language, but if I'm writing something for FreeBSD, it's probably in C. Sometimes I think I would like to look at something like Go or Rust, and sometimes I think I should be using Python for things, but I'm happy enough to use C usually, unless what I'm doing involves a lot of strings, and then I usually would rather not. Yeah.
Well, we're lucky that we have so many more talented developers, let's say, in C, and that are very helpful. And even though they say, "Oh, this is such an easy thing. Why does this person not understand?"
I don't think most of them say it's that easy, and it's not hard to get started with C. It's definitely hard to get really good with it.
Yeah, the learning curve is different from another language.
Yes, like it's kind of like sometimes you're safer when you don't know any C, and then you start learning some, and then you get very dangerous, and then slowly over time you get slightly less dangerous. But you're writing C, so you're always somewhat dangerous.
Yeah, and there are some constructs you can reuse, and some things you have to learn because you don't use that very often.
Like the stuff in Q.H for handling all the singly linked lists and tail queues and stuff, that stuff is just amazingly elegant and very nice to use. Yeah.
If everyone would have to reinvent that, there would be a whole lot more bugs and things breaking. So yeah, libraries are the good thing that helps people focusing on the actual problems. All right, so thanks, Alan, for this set of answers for the questions. Again, people send us more questions if you're interested in any of the stuff that we're doing. Send them to feedback@bsdnow.tv, and we're covered in a future episode. So we hope you enjoyed this interview with Alan. Again, next week it's my turn. We're now going into our news roundup this week, starting with Linux and Ubuntu review of TrueOS, a Unix-based operating system.
Yes, apparently this blog is called Linux and Ubuntu, as if Ubuntu was not a Linux, but interesting.
Well, one is the kernel and the other one is the distribution, maybe?
I suppose.
Okay, but beside that, they start off with, trust me, the name TrueOS takes me back to 1990s when True64 Unix operating system made its presence. TrueOS is a PC, or is PCBSD's new unified brand built upon FreeBSD current code base. Note that TrueOS is not a Linux distro, but is BSD Unix. FreeBSD is known for its cutting-edge features, security, scalability, and ability to work both as a server and desktop operating system. TrueOS aims at having user-friendliness with the power of FreeBSD operating system, and let us start with going into details into different aspects of the TrueOS system. So history, that's pretty much what we know already. TrueOS was founded by Chris Moore in 2005 with the name PCBSD. The initial version focused to make FreeBSD easy to use, starting with providing a GUI-based installer to relatively complicated FreeBSD installer at that time, which was, okay, we don't talk about this old installer anymore. In the year 2006, PCBSD was acquired by IX Systems. Acquired is a strong word in this case, but yeah. Before rebranding as TrueOS in September 2016, PCBSD reached a stage starting considering better than vanilla FreeBSD. Older PCBSD version used to support both x86 and x86-64 architecture. And Chris Moore, the developer founder, says about rebranding, we've already been using TrueOS for the server side of PCBSD, and it made sense to unify the names. PCBSD doesn't reflect server or embedded at all. TrueOS desktop server embedded can be real products, avoids some of the alphabet soup, and gives us a more catchy name.
Yeah, I think the main reasons, when Chris and I interviewed Alfred Perlstein, he kind of pointed out, it's like, if you're at a Linux conference, or just a user conference like Linux Fest Northwest, and you tell people about PCBSD, that's just a random bunch of letters that doesn't mean anything to them. Because nobody really considers computers PCs anymore. You basically a computer, so you don't need the PC part is redundant, and the BSD part has no meaning to a Linux person or a person who maybe is switching from Windows or something. So a better name. I wanted them to call it Illumos, or what's the name of their Lumina OS?
Yeah.
But they went with TrueOS.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the focus of PCBSD was always the desktop, and then it evolved over time, but this is the story we all know in the BSD world. Okay, so then they continue with TrueOS first impressions. The startup is a little longer, maybe due to starting up many services. The heavy KDE, well-suited PCBSD, the C++ Qt5-based Lumina desktop environment is light and fast. Lumina offers an easy way to configure menus and panels. They did not face any problems for continuous use of 2 weeks on a virtual machine, having the minimum configuration of 1 gigabyte, 20 gigs of hard disk, and an Intel 3 gigahertz i3 processor. Lumina Desktop is light and fast, as they figured out. The developers of Lumina know what they are doing and have a good idea of what makes a good IDE. As it happens with any new desktop environment, it needs some time to settle in. Let us hope that they keep to the path they are on it. Well, yeah. They've been on it for some time now. Conclusion, the TrueOS is impressive when considering it is a relatively young system. It is a daring step that TrueOS developers took FreeBSD current rather than FreeBSD stable code base. Overall, it has created in its own place from the legacy shadow of PCBSD. Starting with easy installation, TrueOS is a good combination of software and utilities that make the system ready to use. Go and get a TrueOS ISO to unleash the bleeding edge tag of FreeBSD.
Yeah, the main reason it's based on the bleeding edge version of FreeBSD is that's how you get the latest graphics and Wi-Fi drivers, which is the biggest driving factor behind running FreeBSD on a desktop. So TrueOS makes sense for that.
Sure.
This week's episode of BSD Now is brought to you by DigitalOcean and their new website design. Look at that. Head over to digitalocean.com and check it out. They have new droplet plans with more CPUs, memory, and storage.
Cool.
So you got your standard droplets now. The $5 1 gigabyte one includes more disk space by default now.
Yeah, they send also messages to their users, which I am now, telling us that we have a little bit more storage space. For let's start with the $5 option. This went up from 512 megabytes to 1 gigabyte of memory. It still has one virtual CPU, but the SSD has grown from 20 gigs to 25 gigs, and so did the other option. So they pretty much beefed up a little bit each one of those different droplet options that you can have. And there's also a new option.
You remember the $15 one that we were talking about the other week, which is really nice. They now have 3 different $15 ones to allow you to optimize for what you want. You can get 1 gig of RAM and 3 CPUs, or 2 gigs of RAM and 2 CPUs, or 3 gigs of RAM and 1 CPU. Whichever of those combinations you want for the same price.
That's pretty flexible. Or if you want to go a little bit higher, if you need 32 gigs of memory and 640 gigs of SSD, then you have to pay $160 per month. But it's still a beefy machine if you're doing some really heavy computations there. And again, if you don't need that anymore, then you just switch it off and you're only been paid for the period that you're using this virtual machine.
Yes, with the hourly pricing, all pricing is actually hourly pricing. The monthly price you see is actually a cap. Whereas, if there happens to be 31 days in that month, it would the hourly rate would work out to a little bit more than the monthly rate. So the monthly rate is just a discount for keeping it on the whole month, but you actually pay hourly for everything. So if you fire up a droplet, if you sign up right now, where it's already past the middle of the month, you're only going to pay for that fraction.
Yeah, this is the cool thing. And it's not just the range of different droplets you can get. You can have also, if you log in on the website, because you have to create an account in the first place, you can get all kinds of cool metrics from your system that it's currently running, like CPU usage currently, or what kind of network traffic is going on. So there's a little overview of what your machine is currently doing.
Yes, plus they have all the add-on things like their spaces, object storage, their block storage, where you can get exactly the number of gigabytes of space that you need, whatever that happens to be. Backups, snapshots, business support services, everything you want.
Yeah.
It's all here on the website.
Yep. And if you're interested, then start playing with it using the coupon code FreeBSD Now, and that will give you a $10 credit where you can start off and run a certain application that you always wanted to run in the cloud. And yeah, that's the start that we provide for you. And if you like that, then you can continue with your droplet on your own bill. And yeah, if you don't like it, then you pretty much can close it, delete the droplet, and didn't have to pay anything before, because the $10 is pretty much on us. Wow, the website is really cool, by the way. I have to explore this a little bit further.
They've made quite a few changes there. So head over there, check it out, and when you sign up, use the coupon code FreeBSD Now, and start using FreeBSD Now, and you will get a $10 credit. Now.
Yeah. Don't wait. All right.
Helps if I actually show the website. Sorry about that.
Yeah, well, it's a surprise for people.
Yeah.
Okay. Up next is a FreeBSD setup for a ThinkPad X240. So ThinkPads are super popular with BSD. And not just the FreeBSDs, but also OpenBSDs using them quite heavily in various variants. But this one is for the X240. And
yes, it says, what follows is a record of how I set up FreeBSD to be my daily driver OS on the Lenovo ThinkPad X240. Everything seems to work great, although the touchpad needs some tweaking. I've tried several configurations, but I recommend recompiling X with the EVDev support, and maybe that'll make it better. I think I set a sysctl to enable the Synaptic support or something, and it made my touchpad better on my X220.
Okay. So this is starting off with the basics.
Yep. They say they have suspend and resume working as long as they do it from within X instead of from the command line. Yeah, I have an X220 downstairs that's attached to my exercise bike that has been suspended and resumed like 100 times with no problems.
Oh, cool.
Very happy with it.
What was the thing you tried to dump on me at Asia BSD Con last year?
It was one of those.
Ah, okay.
I have three of the X220s.
Oh, okay.
One of them is now permanently attached to my exercise bike.
Because I didn't take it? Oh, excellent.
No,
We
that
found a
wasn't
good
the
use
one
for it.
that I was trying to give you, but yeah.
Okay, well,
So, one of them sitting
Sorry.
here and has the Z standard experimental code on it.
oh, don't touch it. Don't
The other
break
one's
it.
just sitting on the floor right now.
Okay, a good doorstop. All right, going back to the tutorial. They provide a bunch of config files here for changes you need to make in those. For rc.conf, for example, you can disable a couple of things or enable the adaptive power management in case you're running on the battery, or the WPA supplicant in case you want to connect to your Wi-Fi network, because that works. And also continuing with making sure that you can basic system administration stuff like shutting down the system without entering the password, and adding yourself to the wheel group that does all these things. And that's pretty straightforward as far as I can see. That's pretty nice. And then it goes into installing packages, the typical Xorg setup that you want to have, as also creating an Xinit RC that starts all these desktop managers, and doing
on mine I actually set the login manager to be the PCDM, the TrueOS one, and it gives me, when I go to log in, I type my username and password and then select from a drop down of the different desktop environments, and it launches the one I want, and it remembers the one I used last.
Oh yeah, that's
and then I don't
pretty
have
nice.
to mess with any of the text files that way. And it lets me easily try different ones, and it auto-detects which ones are installed.
So in this case, they're using i3, but that's pretty much up to anyone what they like and what
up
they
to your
don't.
personal taste.
And and then it did some changes, or also to the mixer, because you have a sound card and might want to hear some sounds when you're playing an audio file. If you're running a server, you might as well disable the mixer device. It doesn't help you much. But for a desktop, certainly use the sound on BSD. That's pretty decent. And so you have can play multimedia files, videos, MP3s. Well,
I think the mixer is mostly for controlling the volume.
Yeah, in general, you need to load the sound card or the sound modules in the kernel. But yeah, the same thing. Pretty easy, actually.
Yeah, FreeBSD has gotten pretty good as far as the just works ability. So next story. I dug up this old one from April 8th, 1999 from CNN, who has managed to somehow keep the original look of their page from back then.
Hasn't changed much, yeah.
Yeah. This is a quick story from Walnut Creek CD-ROM saying, they sell a lot of CD-ROMs, but it gives away even more data. Specifically, anyone who has an internet connection is free to log into the Walnut Creek archive, ftp.cdrom.com, and start downloading bits. Even with a good internet connection, however, you should expect to be at it for a while. At the present time, the archive is half a terabyte, or 500 gigabytes, across the RAID 5 array. Even if your 56K modem can somehow manage 7 kilobytes per second, downloading the complete archive would take 70 million seconds. Why didn't they translate that into a number people can actually read?
Well,
it's like 26 months? It's over 2 years, I think, off the top of my head. So that's pretty impressive. Even then, some of the files would be more than 2 years out of date by the time you finish downloading them. So you're going to have to pick and choose anyway. Of course, nobody uses the archive that way. You don't download the whole thing. Instead, they just drop in and grab the odd file or two that they need. Currently, the server can accommodate 3,600 simultaneous download sessions, and they're looking at upgrading it to support 10,000. Currently, they deliver about 800 gigabytes per day of downloads, but they're hoping to reach a terabyte. Interestingly, the hardware behind this is not all that impressive, as a 200 megahertz Pentium Pro with 1 gig of RAM. Of course, back then that was a huge amount of RAM.
Yeah, this is 1999.
Yeah. Even in 2002, I gig of RAM was a lot, right?
Yeah, a lot of things were running 512 or something like that.
Yeah, like I think my first server in 2000, my first FreeBSD server in 2002 started with 256 and got upgraded to 512 megabytes of RAM. It's got a 6-channel Milex RAID controller using ultra-wide SCSI, and then 2 channel links to the PC via a dual-channel Adaptec card, providing PCI to ultra-wide SCSI, and a 256 megabyte internal cache, which is like the size they still have on a RAID controller nowadays. So that was huge then. 4 9-drive disk arrays provide the actual storage. 2 of them are using 18 gig IBM drives, and then 2 smaller ones are using 9 gig Micropolis or Quantum drives. And there's also a separate 4 gig Quantum drive for the system disk. And it uses an Intel 100 base T network adapter connected to some DS3 and OC3 internet circuits. But more importantly, the software is rather prosaic, a copy of FreeBSD, supplemented by some hand-grown FTP mirroring and server code. Because of the massive hardware support, the software only needs to keep I/O going in an efficient and reliable manner. And it talks a bit about FreeBSD and how it uses the fast file system and its innovative features like cylinder groups, support for long file names, symbolic links, and files bigger than 2 gigabytes.
Yeah, don't laugh. This is where we started.
That used to not be a thing on Linux.
Yeah.
You used to not be able to create a file bigger than 2 gigabytes on Linux. One of FreeBSD's finest innovations, the ports collection, makes FreeBSD a delight for open source application users. The ports collection automates the downloading, building, and installation and deinstallation of 2,300 open source packages. I think we're currently at 29,000.
Let me check FreshPorts real quick, because they have a graph
more than
there
10 times that number.
But currently, the port count is 32,595. So
yeah, used to be
impressive.
2,300 in 1999, and that was big.
Well, porters are busy, and they make the whole system interesting, because if there's no software ported for it, then no one uses it.
If you want to know more about what FreeBSD was like during its heyday in 1999, check out this CNN article.
Yeah, go into the archives and think back of where we started and compare it to the Linux kernel archives that went down this weekend, because it was running on a box somewhere
in somebody's basement.
Backup. Yeah. So everyone started somewhere. It's just a matter of how you grow and make this more reliable as you grow as a project. And here are the Beastie Bits this week. We have a bunch of them now, so we are covering them line by line as always. The first one is OpenBSD adds KQ event support to DRM to detect device changes like HDMI cables being plugged in and trigger rand-R events. Yes.
So with this, they have a KQ system built into their port of the Linux Intel graphics drivers, such that they can actually percolate an event via KQ to tell your desktop system, hey, an HDMI cable is just plugged in. You might want to offer the user the option to send their slides to the projector or whatever. That'll be very nice. Mm-hmm. Next was this article I found. Somebody scanned some old documents for archive.org, and they found the thesis describing Quad 3, a Unix-like multitasking operating system for the 6502 processor. If you don't know, that's like the processor in the classic Nintendo, like the first Nintendo, the Famicom or whatever. I think it was also used in things like the Apple IIe and some Commodores and the Atari and lots of other systems. But super basic processor from a long time ago, and somebody made a full Unix-like multitasking operating system for it. The whole thesis is there if you want to go read it. Seems very interesting.
Okay. Even more interesting is our next item, which is for the Unix graybeards that are laughing right now because Windows is getting change mod and change own. Yep, you heard that right.
The Windows subsystem for Linux Insider Build 17063 now has this metadata feature when you mount a file system, such that you can actually chown and chmod a file on Windows.
That's how many years too late? But well, the Unix guys are laughing, but it's there now, and people can play with that on Windows as much as they like.
And of course, on the official blog, the non-root user is Clippy. I just noticed that.
Okay. That probably won't convince any. That probably won't convince any Unix user from switching, but the efforts are there, and there's certainly the page has a bunch of even animated screenshots, actually GIFs, and if people are interested in this and want to know that which kind of Unix commands are now available on Windows in case they have to use it, then check that out. And those are pretty much the things that you expect from chmod and chown.
Next up is a bit of a timeline that I found on the Spectre and Meltdown thing, and talks a bit about the order in which things happened and how they managed to keep it secret for so long and then blow it at the, later on in the process. But it's interesting to read on some of the early stuff that we didn't know about, and looking at the interesting concept that people deduced something was going on when people were proposing patches that would slow Linux down a lot, and Linus Torvalds didn't say profane things to them. Therefore, Linus must have known something was going on. But if you want to know more about the actual timeline and how all that happened, this is a pretty good write-up on it.
Okay. Very cool. For the people who are more into social networking without doing the big ones like Twitter, there is Mastodon out now, and there's a BSD-themed Mastodon instance now at HTTPS BSD.network that's run by Peter Hessler. He's running that instance, and it's an OpenBSD virtual machine on top of OpenBSD VMM hypervisor. So that's already secured and isolated, and people who want to join the social network and talk just BSD topics, then by all means join the BSD.network Mastodon instance.
Now I'm thinking if somebody needs to run Mastodon in a jail on top of Beehive, on top of FreeBSD or something, just for fun. It's like more layers of containers.
Yeah, just because performance is not worth it at all in this setup. And a certain person will, say God is angry when you do that, but okay. Next story, computer-aided instruction on Unix. So what's this? This is a PDF we have in the show notes.
This is a paper from, I think, 1979 about writing a tool to teach people how to use Unix. So it's kind of, an adventure-based text game, kind of.
Oh, right. I see. Yeah.
So you can see it asks questions, and everything the user types is written in italics with the $sign prompt.
Mm-hmm.
So it's teaching you to use the cat command to read the file called food, trying to read the file called president, learning the ls command, the cat command, a bunch of things of that nature.
Okay, this paper is from Brian Kernighan and Michael E. Lesk.
Mm-hmm.
Apps, so yeah, why not?
So this trying to teach like the first batch of students how to use Unix when no one had ever seen it before. It's interesting how much harder it would have been at the very beginning there, because you'd have nothing to relate it to.
Yeah, these were new concepts back then, and you have to, kind of carry them over into the minds of the other people that have to use those. Yeah, so people are interested in teaching, like I am, they should check out that paper. And we have a bunch of news for Asia BSDCon 2018. First of all, if you're still considering it, there is now a travel grant application open at the FreeBSD Foundation. So people
who... if you need a bit of financial assistance to be able to attend the conference, that's one of the things the FreeBSD Foundation does. Is the value in the conference is getting to meet the other people and having all those resources in the same place so we can have the conversations that can only happen in person. And if you need some help to get there to be part of that, that's what that's for.
Yep. By all means, use that. There is money for this. And if it means just writing a little trip report about this, which will be published on the FreeBSD Foundation's blog afterwards.
I'm sure you've heard, we've read most of the trip reports that have ever been published. It's not a daunting thing to just explain what you did while you were there and what you got out of it. And what
there's certainly stuff to talk about.
Yes. But the hardest part will be remembering all of the different things you did. You're
and which order
and to write enough.
Yeah, so that's the least of your problems.
Take a note from Michael Dexter, write some notes as this is happening. It does make it easier.
All right, while we're at Asia BSDCon already, there's also the FreeBSD Developer Summit call for proposals out now, which a certain person who's a co-host of this show has done. I'm not sure who I mean. But
so if you're going to be in Tokyo on the Thursday and Friday? Yeah. The Thursday and Friday before the conference, the 2 days before the conference, we'll be having a FreeBSD Developer Summit. And I think there's also maybe a vendor summit. Anyway, we'll be looking for specific topics to talk about and people to present on their work. So,
yeah, use that because it's not just conference talks, but it's also getting direct into contact with the developers, asking questions, joining a working group for a topic that you're interested in, and seeing what are the topics we're discussing, what are the future developing areas we were going into, what are the problems you could help with probably. So there's bunch of things you can, if you're just listening in, you can get a lot of ideas and feedback from this.
And lastly, there's the call for proposals for Linux Fest Northwest. So this is a conference that takes place in Bellingham in, I guess, northern Washington state. In the U.S., it's April 28th to 29th. And they'll have a number of different tracks, including code, education, humans, infrastructure, Postgres, security, etc. While it does say Linux Fest in the name, BSD has been there for quite a few years. I've talked about ZFS and a couple other BSD things there before. I gave a talk about FreeNAS last year, filling in for Michael Dexter, who unexpectedly had to deal with the birth of his newest child. But we'd love to get more FreeBSD people at these conferences. There'll be a FreeBSD booth, and we'll need people to help answer questions. The Linux people have many questions. They are very uneducated about BSD, and by changing that, we will get more people to use BSD. So, yes, we would like to just flood this conference with BSD. So if you happen to be in the Pacific Northwest, consider coming by and helping out.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very interesting conference, very fun. A lot different than like a BSD can. A little bit less focus on the talks and more on, there's an exhibit hall with lots of booths, almost all of them for open source projects. And it's just people, mostly very like home users and stuff, just wanting to learn more, and great way to pick some of those distro hoppers and lock them into a BSD.
Well, that's a good activity.
Yes, and we just want to basically carpet bomb all these Linux conferences with some BSD.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like an idea for 2018.
Or parachute some BSD people in. Maybe it sounds better than carpet bombing, but anyway.
If it's just for the stickers, then yeah, we can arrange that. All right. Before we go into our feedback and questions section, we should mention our sponsor for that part, which is Tarsnap. We mentioned Colin Percival in his security context in the blog at the beginning of the show. And you can already get that he's a smart person in the not just security area, but in general. And
Yes.
he has...
So when you see that it says tarsnap is for backups for the truly paranoid, if you read some of the middle bit of that article he wrote that we skipped, he kind of explains just how paranoid he really is. And that makes you understand just how well thought out tarsnap was when it was built. But you don't even have to take his word for it. You can look at the source code for the client and see and know that no matter what the backend looks like, your data is secure because it was encrypted with your key and that never left your computer.
Yeah,
only the encrypted data left.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of clients around for various operating systems, so you have no excuse of not using tarsnap because there's a client around for pretty much everyone, the Linuxes, the BSDs, macOS, and also Windows subsystem.
There's a nice GUI even, so there's no excuse for not doing your backups. You know, it's 2018. What do you mean you're not backing up?
And if you know tar from any Unix that you're using, then you pretty much have all the commands already under your fingertips.
Instead of a file, you give it a name, and that name ends up in the cloud instead, but it's super easy.
Yeah. So check out tarsnap, and thank Colin for writing this software and also for his work on security, which makes us all a little bit safer. Okay, feedback and questions for this week. Remember, you can send us always feedback and questions to feedback@bsdnow.tv. First question is from Jason, writing about Don't Break My Ports. That's interesting already. He writes, "Hey Benedict, Alan, and JT. Love the show, such an important resource for the BSD community. My question is, sometimes ports are broken. This means that no other ports can automatically get updated until that glaring oversight by a contributor is resolved. Some usually require reading user ports updating, but not always, and in this situation it did not help him much. Could by chance one of us explain how to get Portmaster running again?" So here's a bit of stuff that happened.
Yeah, so Portmaster is a deprecated tool, but
it's
my
old
understanding
now,
is it was fixed for this new feature eventually.
For the flavors that we now have in ports and packages. Yeah. Okay, so in case we're not using port upgrade, how would we upgrade this one if it's a broken port?
Well, so you can you would reinstall Portmaster manually once the updated version of Portmaster was available. But, you know, at some point we have to break stuff in order to move forward. If you don't want to drink from the fire hose that includes some random sharp edges, that's what the quarterly branch is for. If you use the quarterly branch of ports, you get only security updates, and you only deal with the big update once every 4 months or 3 months. 4 months. And it means you take smaller steps, and it's more manageable. So that's why that's the default for the built packages for the releases. And so maybe that's what you want to look at.
Yep.
But the flavors will be a big advantage. It'll mean more people can use the pre-built packages instead of having to run Portmaster or Poudre themselves. And so it's inevitable that we have to break a couple things to move forward.
Yeah, we'll try to keep this as little as possible, but sometimes the innards are too complicated to make this a nice workaround. But the best thing is, once you're in the new world, then you can benefit from all these new cool features. Okay, we hope we helped you with that. Next one is about the show content in general. Wilati writes, "Dear guys, keep up the great work with the show. Thanks for that feedback. He really enjoys listening to it. He currently works as a truck tire fitter, but he's looking at getting back into the IT field full time. Anyway, he doesn't know if we want to mention it, but well, certainly. He has written an S3-compatible data deduplication program that runs on DigitalOcean Spaces object storage, and he provides the link in the show notes here. It is currently written in Perl and Python, but he thinks to completely rewrite it later in something other than Perl. Anyway, he enjoys the show. Keep it up. And I think he's also yeah, listening to us a lot. And the code looks actually quite interesting. So people should check it out.
There's a blog post over here if you want to check it out. It seems pretty interesting, and it's available under a BSD license.
Yeah, by all means. So things like these could get you another job in IT because people find this interesting and say, well, this is a general good code quality, and why not hire this person? This, could be another thing. All right. Good luck with your future endeavors, and thanks for writing that tool. Next one is Scott with your show is perfect. Oh, it's already starting good. Let me read this one. He writes, hello, I wanted to reach out not with anything useful, but to counterbalance some of the mail that you are receiving to the effect that your show isn't great or could use improvement. Well, we haven't gotten some of that in a while, but still, I'll keep this in a separate folder in case I need some encouragement. So he listens to BSD Now to A, listen to experts.
Yeah, we got to get more interviews because we're not actually experts.
Not in everything, at least. B, he listens to the information we are providing, and he's subscribed to the audio version. Last episode, Alan hurried me along with reading the changelog to Lumina. While that isn't his ideal topic, it's all interesting, and getting him out of his comfort zone is great. Also, during the rest of the show, the conversation was insightful and entertaining. Thanks for the great work you do. I can't wait till next week's show. Well, thank you. That's cool.
Trying to keep the show under like 2 hours is actually kind of difficult sometimes.
Yeah, especially today. But there's a lot of cutting and editing after the word, so you don't get the full live parts. But still, it's great to hear the feedback.
Only a couple of minutes end up on the editing room floor. You get pretty much the whole live experience, except for the things that aren't fit to be broadcast. Or not fit to be recorded, anyway.
Yeah. It's always amazing. I can't wait to get into new BSD conferences and say, hey, random people coming to me, and I've never seen them before. That they're like, hey, Benedict. And it's like, who are you again? Well, I see you on BSD now.
I remember when I went to the conferences and didn't know any people and was all shy and stuff. And now that's not an option because
you have no way of escaping. Okay, yeah, we'll keep this email. I have a separate folder, special thanks, where I put stuff in there in case I'm down or sad. I just read that folder, and I'm not totally happy afterwards, but I see that it's not everything.
Yeah, thanks for the encouragement. It helps.
Yeah. All right. Last but not least is Ken about community culture. He writes, hi, Alan and Benedict. I really love the show. Keep up the awesome work. Good feedback coming in. One question he has is around the community culture for the BSDs. He recently joined the MISC list for OpenBSD since he really likes the idea of security above all else mentality. One big turnoff was, however, how incredibly rude the list was from the lead maintainers of the OpenBSD project. It was such a turnoff, he writes, that I left the list and decided to focus places that are more positive. He can understand that the lists are often terse and to the point, but it seems the maintainers of OpenBSD love to go to personal level and routinely call people stupid and idiots and on and on. This is really unfortunate for an open source project that gets input from volunteers. Turning a newbie into a contributor should be a goal in his opinion, but it is not the case, at least with OpenBSD. Are all the BSD communities this way?
We try not to be. Part of the problem with the mailing list is, especially when you're new, you can't tell who's a well-respected member of the community and who's just some random other person being mean on the mailing list. But we do try to have higher standards over at FreeBSD. It doesn't always work, though. But, yeah, I don't know.
Listen into the different communities. Look at what the other BSD projects are behaving like, or what the tone is on their mailing lists or other communications channels, and try to dip your toes into each of those.
We try to be much nicer. Interesting thing is, even the OpenBSD people are mostly nice in person. Email tends to change the way you read the information as well.
Yeah, the emotion is not there.
Yeah, or it's read differently than it was meant and so on. But, yes.
It shouldn't turn you totally away.
Not all the BSD communities are toxic like that. And
and sometimes people have a bad day and regret afterwards.
Also, we've seen some of the very crazy emails that get sent to that particular OpenBSD list asking ridiculous things.
Yeah, that's true. Some people are trying to troll.
But
try different channels, try online communities, try forums. There are many ways where BSD people are gathering.
There are nice OpenBSD people.
For sure, yeah.
Somewhere.
Well, we hang out with a couple of them. It's
if you watch the video we linked in last week's episode of the interviews with Henning Brauer, Ray Reuter, and Peter Hessler, you probably come out with a very different opinion about OpenBSD from that than you would from, say, reading a random expert from OpenBSD MISC.
Mm. And if you have the chance, go to a BSD conference and meet the people in person, because that's a whole different atmosphere.
Yes. And not only that, but it will change the way you interpret the exact same email later. When you're suddenly reading it and you hear it in the person's voice and maybe their accent or whatever it adds to it, it changes it entirely. I know there's... At one time, there's somebody else in FreeBSD I wasn't getting along with as we were trading messages on emails and a code review. But we met at Asia BSDCon and are all very happy now.
Yeah. The chat room recommends Freenode's OpenBSD channel, which apparently is very nice. So this might be something you can drop in and ask questions there or get to feel the community. And yes, retry. Don't take everything too harsh.
FreeBSD. We try to be nicer.
we make an effort, yeah. All right. Thank you for that feedback. And this is the end of this show. We'll have one next week. So we hope you join in there again. Thanks for listening and see you then.